It should.
Please step aside.
Your badge looks temporary.
We see a lot of contractors.
I've worked here for years.
Then you should know the rules.
I oversee this room.
No, you don't.
I'm the Election Technology Director.
What actually happened that morning was quieter than it first sounded. It was early before the building opened to the public. The County Administration Center was already awake, but only just. Lights were on in some offices, off in others. The hallways smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old carpet. Election equipment carts were lined up near the elevators, labeled and sealed, waiting to be rolled into place. The woman holding the badge was there for one reason. She was preparing voting machines ahead of a scheduled election. It was routine work, but time-sensitive. Every machine had to be tested, logged, and positioned correctly before polls opened. Any delay created problems later in the day. The officer who stopped her was also doing routine work. Extra security had been assigned to the building because of the equipment. That was standard during election periods. The instructions were simple: restrict access, verify credentials, and prevent unauthorized handling of machines. On paper, both of them were doing exactly what they were supposed to do. The problem was that neither one had the full picture. The officer had not been briefed on every department head by name. They had been told to watch for outside contractors and temporary staff, especially during early hours when supervisors were not always present. They were trained to rely on visual cues and immediate verification. When something didn't line up quickly, they were expected to slow the situation down. The woman assumed her presence was self-explanatory. She had worked elections for years. Her badge had always been enough. The machines were under her department's control. She had never needed an escort to access them before. When the officer asked who authorized her access, she answered honestly but briefly. The county. To her, that was obvious. To the officer, it sounded vague. The badge didn't help the way she expected it to. It was legitimate, but it didn't match what the officer thought a department director's badge should look like. It wasn't flashy. It didn't carry a title in large print. It looked, at a glance, like something a temporary worker might wear. Small assumptions began stacking up. The officer noticed the carts, the sealed equipment, and the early hour. They saw someone working alone in a restricted space. They followed protocol as they understood it. Ask questions, request verification, limit movement until certainty is reached. The woman noticed something else. She noticed her explanations weren't landing. She noticed the officer wasn't listening for clarity, but for confirmation of a suspicion. She repeated her role, but the words didn't change the response. This is how misunderstandings escalate inside systems. Not with anger, not with shouting, but with procedure. Each side believed the other was failing to comply. The officer believed she was being evasive. She believed the officer was ignoring clear authority. Neither thought they were acting unreasonably. What made it worse was the setting itself. Election work carries weight. Mistakes are not abstract. Every action is scrutinized later. Both parties were aware of that pressure, and it narrowed their flexibility. There was also a pattern underneath it all. In many government buildings, authority is often assumed based on familiarity. People who look like they belong are questioned less. People who don't are asked to explain more. It doesn't require conscious bias. It grows out of repetition and habit. The officer did not think they were targeting her. The woman did not think she would need to defend her role. But the moment stretched on, and no supervisor was immediately available to clear the confusion. So the situation stalled. What should have been a 30-second check turned into a standstill. Equipment sat idle, schedules slipped, and the longer it went on, the harder it became for either side to step back without losing face. By the time anyone thought to call someone higher up, the tone had already shifted. The woman was no longer just explaining. She was being managed, and the officer was no longer asking. They were enforcing. This wasn't about one bad decision. It was about how quickly systems default to control when trust breaks down, and how slowly they correct themselves when they're wrong. Before that morning, she was known mostly by email signatures and meeting agendas. Inside the county, her name carried weight, even if her face didn't. As the election technology director, she was responsible for systems most people never thought about unless something went wrong. Voting machines, security seals, software updates, chain of custody logs, training manuals, emergency backups. Her job was to make sure elections ran quietly. She didn't campaign, she didn't speak at rallies, she didn't appear on television panels. Her work lived behind closed doors, in server rooms, storage facilities, and conference calls that started early and ran long. Colleagues described her as precise, calm, someone who read policy closely and followed it carefully. She wasn't known for cutting corners or improvising. If a process existed, she respected it. If it didn't, she built one. Election seasons were her busiest time. Long hours, little room for error, public scrutiny without public credit. When things worked, no one noticed. When they didn't, everyone noticed. She accepted that trade-off. Outside of work, her life was steady and unremarkable in the way many professionals prefer. She planned her weeks carefully. She arrived early. She kept detailed checklists. Friends said she was dependable, sometimes to a fault. She took pride in being prepared. That preparation extended to her identity at work. She carried her badge. She kept authorization emails accessible. She knew which doors she was cleared to open and which ones required escorts. Over the years, that knowledge had become routine, almost invisible. She had also learned, quietly, that she was sometimes questioned more than others. Nothing dramatic, nothing she filed complaints over, just small moments, being asked twice for ID when others were waved through, having her role explained back to her in meetings, watching assumptions form before introductions were finished. She noticed, she adjusted, she kept going. Those experiences didn't harden her, they just made her efficient. She learned to clarify quickly, to stay calm, to rely on documentation instead of tone. That morning, she expected another routine setup. She had reviewed the schedule the night before. Machines were due to be staged and tested before supervisors arrived. It wasn't unusual for her to work alone during early hours. In fact, it was often easier, fewer interruptions, less noise. She dressed for work, not for display. Practical clothing, comfortable shoes, her badge clipped where it always was. In her mind, there was nothing ambiguous about her presence in that building. That's why the first question surprised her. She assumed it was a formality, a quick check, something that would resolve itself in seconds. She responded the way she always did, briefly, professionally, without defensiveness. When that didn't work, she repeated herself. When that still didn't work, she slowed down, choosing her words more carefully. She referenced the county, her department, her role. She did not expect to be doubted. People in leadership positions often don't, not because they feel entitled, but because systems usually recognize them. Doors open, names are known, authority moves quietly. This time it didn't. And as the interaction dragged on, she felt something familiar, but rarely spoken aloud. The sense that no matter how accurate her answers were, they weren't the answers being listened for. She stayed composed. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't challenge the officer's authority directly. She believed still that clarity would arrive. What she didn't realize was that the moment had already shifted. To the officer, she wasn't a director explaining her duties. She was a person whose story didn't match expectation. And in systems built on expectation, that gap matters more than truth, at least at first. By the time she understood how far the misunderstanding had gone, it was no longer just about access. It was about control. The misunderstanding didn't begin with confrontation. It began with timing. She arrived earlier than most staff, as she often did during election weeks. The parking lot was half full. A few maintenance trucks were parked near the loading area. Inside, the building hummed with low, functional noise, air systems cycling, distant voices, radios crackling softly. She signed in, passed through the entry checkpoint, and moved toward the storage area where the voting machines were kept overnight. The carts were already staged, seals intact, paperwork attached. Everything was where it was supposed to be. As she checked the first seal number against her list, a voice behind her asked her to pause. It wasn't sharp, it wasn't aggressive, it was procedural. She turned, clipboard still in hand, and answered the first question without thinking much of it. She had answered similar questions before: name, purpose, destination. The officer lingered on her response. There was a moment where both of them waited. She waited for the nod that usually came next. The officer waited for something more specific. Around them, the building continued its slow morning rhythm. An elevator opened and closed. A cleaning cart rolled past the end of the hallway. Someone laughed briefly in an office down the hall. The officer asked her to step away from the equipment while they verified her access. That request surprised her. It wasn't typical, but it wasn't unheard of. She complied, moving a few feet back, keeping her badge visible. She assumed verification would be quick. While they waited, she tried again to explain her role. She mentioned her department. She referenced the schedule. She pointed out the paperwork on the carts, which listed her name as the responsible official. The officer glanced at the documents, but didn't take them. Their attention stayed on her, not the forms. A radio message came through, partially garbled. The officer turned slightly away to listen, then turned back, expression unchanged. They asked again who had authorized her access. This was the moment where a small gesture shifted everything. She exhaled briefly and adjusted the strap of her badge. It wasn't frustration, exactly. It was concentration. She was choosing how to respond without sounding impatient. The officer read it differently. They interpreted the pause as reluctance, the movement as discomfort, the tone as evasive. The questions became more formal. They asked her to stop handling the equipment entirely. They positioned themselves closer to the carts, not threatening, but clearly blocking further work. The space felt narrower, though nothing physical had changed. She noticed her hands were no longer moving through her checklist. They were resting at her sides. That realization unsettled her more than the questions. Time was passing. She could feel it in the way her schedule slipped mentally. Tests would be delayed. Staff would arrive to unfinished setups. She considered calling her supervisor herself, but hesitated, still believing the situation would resolve without escalation. Another employee passed through the hallway, glanced at the scene, and kept walking. It didn't look dramatic. It looked like a routine security check. The officer asked for additional identification beyond her badge. She provided what she could. Her voice stayed even. Her answers stayed consistent. Still, nothing changed. What she didn't know was that the officer had already reached a conclusion, not a final one, but a working one, that she was not who she claimed to be, or at least not fully, that further control was necessary until certainty was achieved. That conclusion wasn't based on a single red flag. It was based on accumulation, early hour, restricted equipment, a badge that didn't match expectation, answers that felt too general. In real time, those details felt significant. To her, they felt irrelevant. The moment tipped quietly when the officer told her she would need to remain where she was until a supervisor arrived. The words weren't harsh, the meaning was. She was no longer being asked to wait, she was being told. She nodded because arguing felt unproductive, because compliance had always worked before, because she believed authority, once informed, would correct itself. What she didn't anticipate was how that compliance would be interpreted. Not as professionalism, but as confirmation. The shift was subtle, but it was unmistakable. Once the officer decided she needed to stay put, the interaction stopped being a conversation. It became a process. The officer stepped slightly closer, close enough to signal control, not close enough to seem threatening. Their radio stayed active at their shoulder. They spoke into it briefly, using codes instead of explanations. She stood where she was told. At first, she thought it would be brief, a few minutes. Someone would answer a call, a name would be checked, the misunderstanding would end. Instead, time stretched. Another officer arrived, slower, more cautious. They were given a quick summary, not a full explanation. The story passed along was incomplete, filtered through suspicion rather than context. She noticed how that changed the way the second officer looked at her. They didn't ask what she was doing. They asked why she was there. She answered again, same words, same calm tone. She pointed to the machines, the paperwork, the schedule. She repeated her title. The response was polite but distant. They asked her to keep her hands visible, not because she had done anything wrong, but because that was standard when situations were unclear. She complied without comment, though the request caught her off guard. It was a small humiliation, not public, not loud, but personal. A facilities employee stopped nearby, waiting for an elevator. He glanced between her and the officers, then looked away. No one said anything. There was no scene to interrupt. It looked official enough to ignore. She felt herself shrinking inside the moment. Not panicking, not afraid in a dramatic sense, but aware that something had gone wrong in a way she couldn't easily fix. Her authority, which usually traveled with her quietly, was no longer accessible. One of the officers asked if she had a supervisor they could call. She gave a name. They said they would handle it. That answer unsettled her more than anything else. It removed her from the solution entirely. She was no longer participating in clearing her own identity. The officers spoke between themselves, quietly, just out of her hearing range. She caught fragments. Doesn't add up. Badge looks off. Election stuff sensitive. Sensitive, that word landed heavily. She understood the weight of it. She had spent years explaining to staff why access mattered, why procedures couldn't bend. She had written parts of those protocols herself. Now those same ideas were being used against her. One officer told her she would need to be temporarily restrained until verification was complete, not aggressively, not with force, just enough, they said, to ensure compliance. She froze for a moment. It wasn't fear of pain, it was disbelief, the sense that the situation had drifted so far from reality that her own reactions lagged behind it. She asked if that was necessary. The officer said it was standard. Her wrists were cuffed loosely in front of her. The metal was cool, the click was soft, no one raised their voice, no one rushed. The hallway remained quiet. That was the moment she felt afraid, not of the officers themselves, but of how easily the system had closed around her, how little room there was, suddenly, for correction. She thought about the machines sitting idle, about the staff who would arrive soon, about the emails that would follow, about how this would look if someone walked in at the wrong moment. Another employee did walk by. This one slowed, hesitated, then continued on. Later, they would say they assumed it was an authorized security matter. She stared at the floor, steadying her breathing. She reminded herself that this would end soon, that once someone higher up arrived, everything would be explained. But the longer she stood there, restrained in her own workplace, the more the misunderstanding felt like something else. Not an error, a dismissal. She wasn't being seen as a professional who needed clarification. She was being treated as a problem to manage. And in that space, quiet, controlled, procedural, she understood something clearly. Even the most careful systems can humiliate without ever raising their voice. The correction came the way it usually does in systems like this, suddenly and from the outside. A supervisor arrived from another floor, responding to a call that had finally reached the right desk. They moved with purpose, not urgency, still assuming this was a minor access issue that needed a signature or a confirmation. They saw the scene before they heard the explanation. 2 officers, equipment carts untouched, and a woman standing quietly with her hands restrained, badge still clipped to her jacket. The supervisor paused. They asked a single question: what's going on? One of the officers began explaining, starting with the concern about unauthorized access, the early hour, the badge that didn't seem right. The explanation was careful, defensive, built on procedure. The supervisor listened without interrupting. Then they looked at her badge. Not closely, not skeptically, just long enough to recognize the name. Their expression changed immediately. They asked her directly to confirm her role. She did. The supervisor's shoulders dropped, not dramatically, just enough to register the shift. They turned back to the officers and said calmly, "She's our election technology director." There was a brief silence. The kind that follows a realization no one wants to have in public. The officer closest to her blinked, then looked again at the badge, this time more carefully. The second officer stepped back half a step, confusion crossing their face. The supervisor asked why verification hadn't happened sooner. The answer came in fragments: calls made, messages delayed, uncertainty about protocol, concern about sensitivity. None of it sounded convincing anymore. The supervisor asked that the restraints be removed immediately. The officer complied quickly, hands moving with a sudden urgency that hadn't been there before. The cuffs came off. The metal clicked open. There was no resistance, no argument. Just quiet correction. The officer apologized, not formally, not fully, just a short, unsettled sentence. "I didn't realize." She nodded. She didn't respond right away. Her wrists felt warm where the cuffs had been. She flexed her fingers, grounding herself. The supervisor apologized next, more clearly. They acknowledged the mistake without excuses. They said it should not have happened, that her credentials were valid, that she should have been believed. They asked if she was okay. She said she was. It was the easiest answer. The officers stood back, uncertain now. The authority they had relied on minutes earlier felt unstable. One of them asked what they should do next. The supervisor told them to step aside and document the incident. The tone had flipped. What had been enforcement was now review. What had been suspicion was now error. She was escorted, not restrained this time, to the equipment area. The supervisor walked with her, speaking quietly about schedules and delays, trying to return the situation to normal. But normal had already passed. As she resumed work, logging seal numbers and powering up machines, she felt the weight of what had just occurred settle in, not as anger, not yet, as clarity. This hadn't happened because of one reckless decision. It had happened because no one stopped the process once it started, because protocol overrode context, because authority failed to recognize itself when it appeared. The officers remained nearby, subdued. One avoided eye contact, the other watched her work as if seeing it for the first time. The supervisor made a few calls, adjusted timelines, assured others that the delay had been handled. On the surface, things moved forward. Underneath, something had fractured. By the time the machines were fully set up, the building had filled with staff. Conversations resumed. The morning unfolded. But the incident didn't end there. It had only just become official. The first response from the county was internal and quiet. An incident report was filed the same day. Statements were taken from the officers involved, the supervisor who intervened, and the woman herself. The language was careful, procedural, focused on timelines and communication gaps rather than intent. She returned to work the next day. There was no dramatic leave of absence, no public apology waiting on her desk, just emails asking for clarification, meetings scheduled to review what happened, and a steady undercurrent of discomfort from colleagues who didn't know what to say. Word spread quickly inside the building, not as gossip but as concern. People who had worked with her for years were surprised. Some were angry on her behalf. Others were unsettled by how easily it had happened. Within weeks, the county placed the officers involved on administrative review. This was standard, officials said. No assumptions of wrongdoing, just an examination of whether protocol had been followed appropriately. The review raised uncomfortable questions. Why hadn't her credentials been verified sooner? Why wasn't a supervisor contacted immediately? Why did the process escalate to restraint without clear cause? The answers varied, but none erased the outcome. As the internal review continued, the incident reached beyond the county. A local reporter obtained a copy of the report through a public records request. The story ran with a restrained headline, focusing on election security and workplace treatment. It didn't accuse, it didn't sensationalize, it simply laid out the facts. Public reaction followed. On social media, responses were divided at first. Some defended the officers, citing election sensitivity. Others focused on the image that stuck most clearly, a senior election official detained in her own workplace. As more details emerged, the tone shifted. Professionals from other counties weighed in, describing similar experiences. People shared stories of being doubted despite credentials, of procedures that escalated before questions were answered. The county issued a public statement acknowledging the mistake. They emphasized that the woman had been acting within her authority. They expressed regret for how the situation was handled. Behind the scenes, discussions turned legal. Her role required public trust. Her credibility mattered. Being restrained while performing election duties had consequences beyond personal embarrassment. It raised questions about interference, even if unintentional. She filed a civil lawsuit. The claim focused on wrongful detention, professional harm, and failure to follow proper verification procedures. It did not allege malice. It did not seek punitive spectacle. It sought accountability. Over months of negotiation, depositions were taken, policies were examined, training manuals were reviewed line by line. The county chose to settle. The agreement totaled $4.8 million. In their statement, county officials said the settlement was not an admission of intentional wrongdoing. It was a recognition of failure, a step toward closure, a commitment, they said, to do better. As part of the settlement, policy changes were announced. Credential verification procedures were revised. Supervisory escalation requirements were clarified. training emphasized de-escalation and verification before restraint, especially in professional settings. For the officers involved, outcomes varied. One received additional training, another was reassigned, no one was publicly fired. The county described the response as corrective, not punitive. The woman remained in her position. She continued overseeing elections, continued preparing machines, continued working early mornings and late nights. But the impact lingered. She described it later as a quiet shift, a heightened awareness, a loss of assumption that documentation alone would protect her. She became more cautious, more deliberate about who was present, who was informed. Not because she doubted herself, because she no longer trusted the system to recognize her without proof. The settlement closed the case legally, but it didn't erase the moment. The image of standing restrained in a familiar hallway stayed with her, not as a trauma she spoke about often, but as a reference point. A reminder of how authority can be invisible until it's denied. The county moved forward, elections continued, machines were set up, voters came and went. Most never knew what had happened behind the scenes. But for those who did, the incident became something else. A lesson in how quickly professionalism can be overridden by assumption and how expensive that mistake can be. Stories like this are often framed as extremes. A bad officer, a shocking abuse, a clear villain. This one doesn't fit that mold. No one used slurs, no one shouted, no one set out to humiliate a colleague, and that's precisely why it matters. Bias doesn't always announce itself. More often, it operates through expectation, through pattern recognition that feels like experience, through shortcuts that save time until they don't. In this case, the system didn't fail because someone hated her. It failed because the system trusted its assumptions more than its verification process, because procedure moved faster than curiosity. Authority is often recognized visually before it's confirmed administratively. People make quick judgments about who belongs where, who needs to explain themselves, and who doesn't. Those judgments are shaped by repetition, not intent. When someone doesn't fit the familiar pattern, the burden quietly shifts. They are asked more questions, their answers are scrutinized, their credentials are treated as provisional instead of definitive. This is how risk grows inside ordinary interactions. The officers believed they were protecting the integrity of an election. The woman believed she was doing the same. Both were operating under pressure. Both relied on systems meant to prevent harm. The difference was who had the power to pause the situation. Systems tend to escalate more easily than they de-escalate. Control is built into protocol. Trust often is. That imbalance is where reform matters. Training that emphasizes verification over suspicion. Procedures that require supervisors to be involved before restraint. Clear standards for recognizing professional authority in shared spaces. None of these changes require dramatic overhauls. They require intention. They require acknowledging that harm can occur without hatred, that humiliation can be procedural, that good intentions don't prevent bad outcomes. The $4.8 million settlement wasn't just compensation. It was a signal that even quiet mistakes carry weight, that public trust depends not only on security, but on fairness. For election systems especially, legitimacy is fragile. It relies on transparency, respect, and confidence in the people doing the work. When those people are undermined by the very systems they uphold, the damage reaches further than one hallway on one morning. This story isn't about fear. It's about listening sooner. About slowing down when certainty feels urgent. About recognizing that authority doesn't always look the way we expect, and that expectation should never replace verification. Progress in cases like this isn't dramatic. It's procedural. And it starts by believing the badge the first time. Moments like this don't usually make national news. They happen in offices, hospitals, schools, and government buildings every day. Quiet misunderstandings, assumptions that go unchecked, processes that move forward before anyone stops to ask a better question. What makes this story stand out isn't just the settlement or the title of the person involved. It's how familiar the situation feels once you sit with it. Many people have experienced some version of this, being doubted at work, being asked to prove authority that others are allowed to carry without explanation, being managed instead of heard. If you've had an experience like that, your perspective matters. How did it change the way you moved through your job afterward? Did it make you more cautious, more prepared, less willing to assume systems will work the way they're supposed to? We'd like to hear your thoughts. If you're watching this as someone in a position of authority, consider how often you pause to verify instead of escalate, how often you rely on instinct instead of confirmation. Small choices shape outcomes more than we like to admit. And if you're someone who's been on the receiving end of a misunderstanding like this, know that these stories deserve attention, not for outrage, but for learning. If you want to see more reporting like this, grounded, investigative, and focused on real people navigating real systems, consider following or subscribing. Not for drama, for clarity. Because the most important stories are often the quiet ones, and they only change things when we pay attention to them.